school at a tender age. I'm still not over it. I used to wheel her around looking desperate. It was right before Starbucks hit, and it was like desperately looking for grown-ups who spoke English anywhere at all.
Right. Right, we're good to go. Hello and welcome everyone to PMP Live. My name is Bashan. I'm part of the event staff, Politics and Prose. Before we do get started with this event, just a couple quick items that I would like to go over. First, at any time during this event, if you have a question you'd like to ask of either Judge Canan or Ms. Broderick, we would ask for you to place it into the Q&A section, which you can find towards the bottom of your webinar screen. Separately, at any time during this event, you'll be able to go to the chat section where you can find a link which will take you directly to the Politics and Prose website, where you'll be able to purchase a copy of Pursuing the Horizon Stories of Justice by, of course, Judge Canan. That aside, I have the pleasure of introducing you to Shelly Broderick and the Honorable Russell F. Canan. Ms. Broderick is Dean Emerita and Joseph L. Raw Chair of Social Justice at the University of District of Columbia School of Law. Judge Canan served as a health aide for the East Coast Migrant Health Project and worked in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida trying to improve the lives of migrant farm workers. As an attorney, Judge Canan practiced criminal defense and civil litigation in the District of Columbia, Maryland, and throughout the South. In 1983, Judge Canan helped establish the Southern Center for Human Rights in Atlanta, Georgia, where he represented prisoners on death row. Judge Canan was appointed to the Superior Court of the District of Columbia in 1993 by President Bill Clinton. Judge Canan is the former presiding judge of the Criminal Division and chaired a committee studying wrongful convictions and proposing reforms. Judge Canan is a co-editor and contributing author to Tough Cases, Judges Tell the Stories of Some of the Hardest Decisions They've Ever Made. Without any further ado, the Honorable Russell Canan and Shelly Broderick.
Thank you so much, Bashan. And good evening, Judge Canan. If it's all right with you, I hope you will call me Shelly.
Hope you will call me Russ.
All right, we've got a plan. So I wish I could show the picture of the book, but I only have the galleys. Russ, do you have the book that you could actually show?
You know, by coincidence, I actually do.
Excellent news. All right, Pursuing the Horizon Stories of Justice by Russ Canan. I loved the book. I loved the book. It made me cry, it made me laugh, and it made me think. Not entirely in that order. So it's dedicated, the name Pursuing Justice came from a Stephen Crane quote. Tell us about that.
Well, first, just a few thank yous.
I'm sorry, Pursuing the Horizon.
Just a few thank yous to my family and friends who supported me through the writing of this book, many of whom actually read chapters and made suggestions. Thanks to Bashan and Beth Wang of Politics and Prose, my very favorite bookstore in the world. So thank you, Politics and Prose. It's a real honor to be on a program here. And thanks to my friend Shelly, the dean. We were dear friends for many, many years. We were puppy criminal defense lawyers back in the day together, and we stayed great friends, and we've shared quite a few things as our lives have intersected. And finally, to thank my new friends at 12 Tables Press, particularly the publisher, Steve Eric. During the course of this book, you have to make a zillion decisions. We always made them together. We always finally agreed. So it was a real honor to work with Steve as we went through this. This book, Pursuing the Horizon, Stories of Justice, really was a combination of two interests of mine that came together at the same time. About 4 years ago, myself and two colleagues and friends on the court, Greg Mize and Fred Weisberg, we got together and we thought that there might be some value in writing stories for the general public about how judges make their hardest decisions, sort of giving the general public a behind the scenes viewpoint of how those decisions were made. And we were very fortunate to join with lawyers, judges around the country from Texas and California, Washington State, Upper Michigan, the Little Traverse Bay Band of Ottawa Indians, and their Chief Judge Ali Greenleaf Maldonado, and judges from Minnesota, and one of my favorite places, the Bronx, where my mother's from, Liz Gonzalez, and Florida as well. Some of the cases are really quite well known. The Terry Schiavo case by Judge George Greer, the Elian Gonzalez case in Miami by Judge Jennifer Bailey, and our very own Judge Reggie Walton, who was a former colleague at the Superior Court and then moved on to the federal court, and he writes about the Scooter Libby case. So we put that book together, and it was a very rewarding and enriching experience, and that book came out 2 years ago. After the book came out, I thought maybe I'd like to expand on some of the themes in that book. And to the extent the book was a success, it helps celebrate institutions presently under attack at times, the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary. Many issues of redemption and forgiveness and mercy ring through many of the chapters. And I thought perhaps I could expand on that in a number of ways. First, I wanted to add a few new chapters from Behind the Bench. The chapter in Tough Cases, Rough Justice, is reprinted here in this book. And that case essentially deals with the age-old conundrum of, in terms of, do the ends justify the means if the ends are just? And is there any situation where what should a judge do when strictly following the law can end up in a miscarriage of justice? Another chapter, Right to Live, Right to Die, deals with the wrenching decision for a trial judge as to whether or not to terminate life support. This was a case in the footsteps of the Terry Schiavo case when sadly a family was in dispute as to whether a loved one in a persistent vegetative state should terminate life support and die with dignity. And then the last chapter from this side of the bench is called The Illusion of Delusion, the Murder of Viola Drath, and the Strange Case of General Albert Garrow Moot, which was a high-profile murder case where, through various circumstances, we ended up trying the defendant by Zoom well before there was really a Zoom common in our lives, and it became a very complicated case, very draining case, and coincidentally also became a Hollywood movie starring Christoph Waltz and Vanessa Redgrave and Annette Bening. But I wanted to expand it as well because of the themes of forgiveness and redemption to some death penalty cases that I had. One at the beginning of the process, that's Helter Skelter's son, a death penalty trial of an individual that the state was calling the worst of the worst. And then at the sad and gruesome end of a case, the burning at the wire of the execution of John Evans, that was in Alabama, of an execution in Alabama. So with these themes in mind, I really wanted to do something I've been thinking about for a very long time, which was to honor the memory of my older brother, Jeff, who at age 17 volunteered for the Army and then volunteered to go to Vietnam and was killed a year later. Obviously, this was something that tore up our family, but I wanted to write something to honor him and also to find out exactly what happened. How did he die? We didn't really know. Connect with his fellow soldiers, and then finally try to go to Vietnam and pay homage to him by going to see the site where in fact he was killed. So this is what I was thinking about for the book. The title itself, the original working title was Pursuing Justice. It comes from Deuteronomy, justice, justice shall you pursue, which is a title I liked. I was never totally in love with it, but I liked it. And then about a month before I submitted the galleys to 12 Tables, I was talking to my sister Stacy on the telephone. And you know, when you have a sibling that you're close to, like I am with Stacy, the silences often tell you a lot. And she said, what is the name of your book again? And I said, Pursuing Justice. And then there was the silence of Stacy. And she said, well, that's a good title. I like it, but it sounds awfully familiar to me. You did Google it, didn't you? To which I replied, duh, no, I didn't. And while we're on the phone, I'm going on the computer, and lo and behold, there are any number of books called Pursuing Justice, nonfiction books, biker books, you name it. There are a lot of Pursuing Justice books. And I talked with Steve Eric, the publisher at 12 Tables. We talked about, he said, there's not a copyright issue. So if you really want to use it, it's your turn to use it. The only thing we can't do is call it Pursuing Justice with Harry Potter. We might sell some more books, but we'll likely get sued. And so I was thinking about going back to the drawing board, and I like to take photographs. And in my study upstairs, I had this photograph from Tasmania, Australia, and it's a picture of the horizon and off a dirt road. And I thought the horizon was an apt metaphor for justice, because justice, true justice, justice for all, like the horizon, is something that will never be within our grasp, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try and obtain it. And so this book is really about judges and criminal defense lawyers and prosecutors and jurors and those accused of crime, those who were victims of crime, social workers, nurses, mental health workers, jurors, and everyone else involved in the justice system as they seek to achieve justice. And so I was thinking, well, maybe Pursuing the Horizon might work. I liked it. And so I went back to Professor Google. There were no books called Pursuing Horizon, but there was a poem by Stephen Crane, who was really one of my favorite authors. I remember reading The Red Badge of Courage, probably in high school. It was a book that always stuck with me. And I thought, actually, that name of that book was appropriate. And he had a poem called Pursuing the Horizon. So I thought it all fit together. So that's how we got the title.
I like it. I like it very much. And I think it really works. And the poem is reprinted in the book, and it is shortened to the point. And it's, it kind of says, it sort of feels like, and pursuing the horizon is not a futile endeavor, as some might think. And you've been pursuing the horizon through your life. So I wanted to go not quite in the order that the book goes, but more in order of your life, for a reason I'll get to. You grew up in Flushing, New York, as did my boyfriend, on Long Island, just outside of New York City. And you're a middle child, middle class, would you say?
Yeah, my father worked in a gas station. He owned a gas station.
Okay.
And my mother was an artist who was before her time, but she took care of the 3 kids, though.
Okay. And you were into baseball and other sports.
Yes.
So regular kid growing up in the 60s, you loved the Beatles. I know that, right?
I love rock and roll and the blues and Motown. Yes.
And then, you know, this awful thing happened when you were in high school. Your older brother, he sort of enlisted. Your dad had one arm behind his back and kind of nudged him in to the enlistment, because he was. Tell us a little bit about what caused that.
Yeah, well, he was struggling. He, today's day, we're all so knowledgeable about learning disabilities, but I'm sure he had a number of learning disabilities which made school difficult. And then he started hanging out with some guys and got in trouble with the law. And he was able, back in those days, to volunteer he was only 17. He had to get the consent of my parents. He was able to volunteer for the Army and get a guaranteed posting in Germany, which is where he went. But when he was there, he met some other guys and they became gung-ho. So even though he was in Nuremberg, Germany, all 3 of them volunteered for Vietnam. And what happened to him was always a bit of a mystery. I had the documents, the file such as it were, actually sent away to St. Louis, where you have the Army archives, and I knew very little about what actually happened to him, who he was with, how he died, where he died, and all that. And the chapter I write here, Death on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, is really the story of my family. My sister was involved in this a lot, in our attempt to honor his memory and actually go to Vietnam and try to find the site where he was killed and pay homage to him there.
So as you know, and we may have talked late into the evening over a martini or two about this. My brother was also very badly wounded in Vietnam. I was luckier than you. He was luckier than Jeff. I know firsthand the toll it takes to say goodbye to your brother and to then have something catastrophic happen. And you and I have both been to Vietnam and sort of found where they were. So tell the story about, which is in the book, but it's just absolutely fascinating, about how you found out about where Jeff got was killed.
So I had for years tried to find out, and I had whatever documents I had. And then one afternoon, Stacy calls me, and she had been doing a research project with her teenage son, Gabe, on Vietnam. And Stacy was always very good with the computer, and she came across something called the Virtual Wall, which is a website for everyone, every man and woman who was killed in Vietnam. There's a web page dedicated to that person. And these were in the days where I barely knew how to use the internet. And she called me, says, "You won't believe it, that there's a photo of Jeff on this virtual wall that we've never seen." And so naturally that was quite shocking. And it was posted by an Alan Cheney. And we knew nothing, we didn't know who Alan Cheney was. And she had to run, and I started playing around with the internet, and I found that Alan Cheney had a website. He'd served 3 tours in Vietnam, and he'd been wounded on September 14th, 1967, which was the day that Jeff was killed, the date that, of course, I never forget. And so with my limited skills, I ended up sending an email to Alan Cheney, and I'll just read that email. "Dear Mr. Cheney, my name is Russ Canan, and I am the brother of Jeff Canan, who was killed in action on September 14th, 1967. For the past few years, I've been trying to find out information concerning my brother and the circumstances of his tour of duty and death in Vietnam. I used the services of Delta Force Associates to retrieve his military records, but the records were not very helpful." I then go over that Stacy had found the photograph. "I've now read your site and greatly appreciate you posting that picture. Needless to say, it was very moving for us, and we would like to learn more about your relationship with Jeff and any other information you or others may have had about him. I noticed specifically that you were wounded the same day Jeff was killed, September 14th, 1967. Is it possible that you were with him on that day? Again, our deepest thanks for your consideration in posting the picture. We look forward to hearing from you, Russ." Alan Cheney wrote back. He said, "Dear Russ, my name, as you know, is Alan Cheney. I live in Texas. I am now retired after 31 years in the U.S. Army and the Army National Guard. I was a member of the same night ambush patrol on which Jeff was killed. I was in a different position than Jeff. I was hit by a Viet Cong automatic rifle. Our patrol was counter-ambushed, and Jeff was hit by, I was told, one of our Claymore mines that the Viet Cong had turned around and then detonated toward his position. We were then fired upon by a number of VC until a relief force from our unit arrived. I learned that Jeff had died prior to the arrival of the helicopter. Jeff and I were loaded on the helicopter and flown to the 25th Infantry Division base camp in Cu Chi. After arriving, Jeff was taken away, and that was the last time I saw him. Jeff and I were friends during our tour, as were the others. Jeff has been in my memories since that fateful night. I love him like a brother. God bless you and Stacy and all of Jeff's family. I hope these words will be of comfort. Please let me hear from you again.
Incredible. So just, I've got so much more I want to talk about the book, but I do want to talk, I want you to talk about when you met Alan and you went to Vietnam and it really, your leave taking of Jeff, your final leave taking.
Well, you know, life has these fortuitous moments that you can never plan. And I was on the court at that time, and just happened that I was invited to go to Vietnam, both to Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, to work with Vietnamese judges on rule of law programs. And I contacted Alan. I said, is there a way to find out where exactly you were wounded and Jeff died? And he referred me to his unit called the Bobcats. And in their archives, it says he was killed 500 meters south of the highways 6A and 100. So after our program was over, my wife and two young boys at the time, we hired a guide and a translator, and we actually went to that spot and laid flowers down and paid homage to him. And then many years later, my older son Lucas and I went to Texas to go to Austin and listen to music, and we also wanted to visit Alan. Alan, like your brother, had suffered from PTSD, so we had a very moving meeting at his farm in outside Waco, Texas.
I love it. All right, so you went to Syracuse, and after Syracuse,
Oh, excuse me, I forgot to ask Bashant just to put up the third photo.
Oh, yeah.
On this story. So we'll just put up Bashan, the third one. So this
There
was
he
the
is.
photograph of my brother that Alan Cheney had posted on the virtual wall.
Good looking guy.
Yeah, I think
I'm not
before we
gonna
went
make
on, you said he got the good looks in the family. You said,
I did not say a word, nothing. All right.
You're talking to a judge, you know. Thanks, Bashan. You can take it down.
So, okay. So after the book opens with you driving down to North Carolina Klan country. What in the world possessed a guy from Flushing, New York, after college to find himself in rural North Carolina working for a Catholic nun?
Well, I guess it's one of these fortuitous parts in life. I was thinking of going to law school, but I had this opportunity to work in North Carolina, and these days they call it a gap year, I suppose, but I decided to do this. And Bashan, maybe use the first photo for a second or so.
I think it's the middle photo.
No, I think it's the first. Well, while Bashan's doing that, so as I drove into Smithfield, North Carolina, this billboard was 100 feet up in the air. I had no idea. I was so naive, 22 years old. And I was working with a Catholic nun named Sister Joseph Beatrice. And the idea was to go out to the migrant farm worker camps. And back in those days, that was just 20th century slavery. Mostly African-American men, some women from Central Florida would come up north to South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, as far as New York and Connecticut to work the season in Smithfield. That was largely tobacco and potatoes. And so this is the Klan sign I saw as driving into there. So it was a very intense place to be. Thank you, Bashan. And I got to meet this extraordinary Catholic nun named Sister Joseph Beatrice, who was this remarkable woman. She was a nurse. She was from Lexington, Kentucky. She seemed very old to me at the time. She was 64. And she lived a pretty quiet life as a nurse in various schools and things like that, and saw a documentary about the horrors of migrant farm workers. And she volunteered to serve on this, and I was basically her gopher. I did whatever she told me to do and drove around to the various camps, taking TB tests and things like that.
Were you a Vista?
No.
So without going into all of it, the book does talk about some of the horrible, horrible things that you saw done to the migrant farm workers, and you got to know them and you talked to them, and and I know that it opened your eyes. You can tell from the book. And you told me offline that some lawyers from the Department of Justice showed up, and that was inspiring to you, and one of the reasons that made you think about, yeah, all you could do was, refer them somewhere, but these lawyers could really do something. Just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, we saw incredibly brutalized people. I mean, people whipped by chains and having dogs sicked on them, and I was nervous and scared. Sister Joseph Beaches was completely fearless, and she somehow wrangled a meeting with the governor of North Carolina. And when he did nothing, she says, we're going to the FBI. And one thing led to another. We contacted lawyers from the Criminal Division of Civil Rights who came down and started an investigation. And I could see that being more than just a referral for things, maybe doing things. So it was a part of an inspiration to go to law school.
And of course, we also share law school. I foolishly went to a name brand Georgetown Law School. You went to the cool place, Antioch Law School, where I ended up spending the rest of my life after law school. So talk about the decision to go to this progressive, anti-authoritarian, pass-fail, crazy new law school.
Well, I was thinking, I talked to a friend of mine who went to Georgetown, who was going, a second-year student at Georgetown, and he said he hated every minute of it, but there was this new law school that was doing all these interesting dynamic things, and I was driving up from North Carolina on the way to New York, and he knew someone at the law school, and he was in the very first year of class, and it was all the things you said, including, but also truthfully, we got to say it was chaotic and disorganized and wild in its own way, but just fabulous people.
One of the best parts.
Yes. And so I got sold right then and there. I said, this is the place for me. And I'm very, because Antioch then had, as does your law school now, the DC School of Law, I think a third of my credits were clinical credits, which means I was actually representing clients in my second year in law school. In my first year in law school, went to court and had trials my second year. It gave me the, I would say confidence. I'd like to say more bravado than brains to join up with two of my Antioch classmates, Elkanah Burns and Jeff O'Toole, and we opened up our own legal practice and took court-appointed cases. So it was a great experience for me.
I so regretted that I had made the choice I made, but now in retrospect, I'm glad I saw the other, so that I would understand that, okay, it's chaos, but it's good chaos. So you guys started up a practice. I remember going to that crazy building where you had your offices. You actually had a legal clinic in there and took in the law students and showed them how to try cases. How long did you do that?
Well, I was in private practice for 16 years, and then probably my legal career changed when I went with Stephen Bright, who was kind enough to write the foreword for this book, the former director of the Southern Center for Human Rights, and George Kendall, who became a part of the ACLU and the general counsel for the Legal Defense Fund. And the three of us went to the Old Souls Unitarian Church up on 16th Street to hear Millard Farmer, who was a death penalty lawyer in Georgia. And for those who are not the lawyers, you get a lawyer at the state expense for your trial and your appeal, but anything after that, you're not entitled to a state-funded lawyer. And so many of these people on death row didn't have lawyers to go to the Supreme Court. We were sold a little bit of a bill of goods, but we knew it at the time. If we took one case to the Supreme Court, we wouldn't necessarily have to follow through all the post-conviction. And we did, and we got the case returned to the trial court, and within a year or so, Steve became the director of what's now called the Southern Center for Human Rights, and I went down with him along with Bob Moran, who also became a judge and ultimately the chief judge of our court, and Christy Freeman. So it was just the four of us. Brian Stevenson, who was kind enough to write the blurb on the front cover, came down that summer as a law student intern and lived with me for that summer. So this band of lawyers were going all over the South doing cases. So it was something that we all felt very strongly about. And I must say, I'm very sad to see in the Washington Post today that, the President administration finds it necessary to execute 5 people who would not be executed on January 20th. So it's the death penalty's arbitrary and capricious nature is never more apparent in something like today's news.
It's awful. I thought about exactly the same thing this morning when I saw that in the paper. So one of the chapters in the book is called Burning at the Wire, the execution of John Evans. In that case, you did everything you can possibly do, including personally visiting with Governor George Wallace 3 times. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, it was actually twice. The first time was pretty formal in his office, and John's mother and son talked to someone who was in the Army at the time, and John had definitely killed someone. It was an awful murder. He killed a father in a pawn shop who had 2 young children. So it was a terrible crime. But I think he had really changed. He had found redemption. He was being attended to by a Catholic priest. He was a changed man that he had been. He just wasn't the same young, impetuous man that he had been when he killed his victim. So there's a whole team of people trying to save him. Wallace denied the clemency, and then the evening of the actual execution, we got word that he was willing to speak to us again. So I went to his house, the governor's mansion, with John's sister, just the 3 of us, and an aide from the governor. And we thought he might change. He was clearly not going to run for office again. He had done a very public renunciation of his past racist views. He had claimed that he'd found religion late in his life. So we thought maybe he'll do it. And we spent an hour talking to him, and he didn't. And so what was left was to see an excruciating execution on the electric chair that malfunctioned.
Well,
that shocked the world.
The third interaction was that it was a 14-minute effort that failed to kill him, and you demanded to talk to the governor again, right?
That's right. You're right. There were three.
Yeah, I know. I read the book. I recommend it, Russ. You should read it.
All right, you got me on that one, Shelly.
All right, and now we're working on the next one. Go ahead.
Okay. Yes. So during this horror, I demanded of the person who was on the phone with the governor who was filing all this that this was cruel and unusual punishment, and this should stop right now. And that, of course, was denied. But at least I think it was valuable to do that because, I mean, it was the 6th person to be killed in the United States after the death penalty came. So it was a big deal around the country and around the world. And I think it brought the horrors very close to home about the death penalty.
Well, and his mother, with whom he had been reconciled, said he left this world as a true Christian, and that just rips your heart out, that. Oh, but we murdered him anyway. Anyway, so moving on in the book, there's a chapter, Helter Skelter Son. This is about as grim a case as you can imagine. Your client was a 17-year-old prostitute. He stabbed the first guy he killed. He stabbed 20 times and carved his eyeball out. And the second guy, he had 39 stab wounds. And yet, by the end, I was right with you pulling for him not to get the death penalty. Talk a little bit about that case.
All right, I use his name, Richard Mason. That's not his real name. He had been sentenced to death. He killed his cellmate, so it wasn't really an issue. as to what he had done. And on top of that, with all the, I think it was actually 45 stab wounds, many in the back, he scrawled in the decedent's own blood, "Helter Skelter, son." Helter Skelter, for those who don't know, is a Beatles song, a raunchy, somewhat violent Beatles song that Charles Manson took as his anthem to kill people in California. So our client called himself Helter Skelter, son. And I say our client because I do want to give a shout out to my friend, Jerry Fisher. We were teammates. We worked on this case together, and Jerry is also now a judge on the Superior Court. And so it was a tough case. He got convicted and sentenced to death, and he won the Supreme Court lottery. I had nothing to do with this. The Maryland Court of Appeals public defenders did this, and he got his conviction remained, but his death sentence got reversed. And so Jerry and I were there to do the resentencing of someone who the state called. And, you know, so many cases, and rightfully so, the prosecutors, the police have done something inappropriate or just awful. But this was a case where the prosecutor was a very honorable person. You know, I don't think he really wanted to do this, but his viewpoint was, look, this is really the worst of the worst. If we don't use the death penalty in Maryland for this kind of case, I can't really justify it for almost any other. So we then were in the retrial for the sentencing part of this case. And Bashan, you could maybe show the last photograph. I'll show you the crime scene photo of Helter Skelter's son. So this was done in the defendant's hand from the decedent's blood. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bashan. So this chapter starts off with this. The subtitle is, well, the title is Helter Skelter, son. And the first page and a half goes, I slowly walk down the jury box and separately look each juror in the eye. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as I conclude my remarks, I ask each of you to consider the poet's words as you return to the jury room to begin your overwhelming and humbling deliberations to determine Richard Mason's life or death. No man is an island entire of himself. Every man is a part of the continent, a piece of the main. Every man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore, never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the bell tolls for Richard Mason, and the bell tolls for you. Richard is a life worth saving. Please save it. Thank you for listening. I sit down in my chair next to Richard and my co-counsel, Jerry Fisher. We have done all that we could do, and I try to relax, but I cannot. It is now Richard's turn to address the jury. His hands are trembling a bit as he stands up and looks at the jury, getting ready to plead for his life. After he finishes, it will all be up to the jury, and all we can do is wait to learn his fate. It's been a tough case. This was not the first time Richard had committed murder.
Well, I don't want to, it's this book, you should really be ordering this book. It's just excellent. It's just fascinating what happens. And it just really makes you think. I want to move on. I hate to. The book goes into, it has 3 chapters, and there were kind of 3 big highlights from your career as a judge on the Superior Court. I personally think there should be 4, because the one I would add would be the fact that you are in a rock and roll band called Deaf Dog and the Indictments. A highlight of my life was when you played a big party for me and I got to sing My Girl with the band. Thank you, Russ. Thank you. I owe you for life. So tell how you ended up naming your rock and roll band Deaf Dog and the Indictments.
I'm not sure the readers want to know that, but it's a fun story anyway. So it was a band of judges, 7 judges, and we were going to do back in the day when the court had money, we went away for training purposes, and we thought of, the court did the idea of doing a talent show. It'd be fun, bring people together, and a bunch of us knew each other, liked music and played various instruments. and we were rehearsing in my living room on a spring day, and we were trying to find a name because every rock and roll band, we do rock and roll, blues, and Motown, has to have a cool name. That's obvious. And we just couldn't find a name. Someone said, how about the Indictments? It's sort of legal. Didn't quite make it. And as we were rehearsing that first day, my sons were watching. They were interested, but then got bored and left the living room, went outside, as did my wife. And one of the guys said, well, at least, it was my German Shepherd at the time, sitting amidst all this rock and roll paraphernalia, electric guitars, amplifiers. And one said, at least your dog seems to like us. And I said, I'm sure she does, but she's deaf as can be. Somehow, Deaf Dog in the Indictments was born. And we're still playing 16 years later. So it's been a lot of fun. And we love playing for you, Shelly.
Well, and each and every time I see you, here's how I know how mainstream we are now. You know, you go to the DC Circuit Judicial Conference. Are they dancing to the foxtrot? No, they're dancing to Deaf Dog in the Indictments. You know, it's like hard to even wrap my brain around, but it's a great band. I recommend the audience find a way to hear them. All right, so there are 3 cases that you talk about. One is talked about in your first book, Tough Cases. The chapter is called Rough Justice. A second is the Right to Die case, and the third is the Illusion of Delusion, a terrible murder case of a Georgetown socialite. Talk a little bit about Rough Justice.
Well, as I said in the beginning, Rough Justice really is one of my hardest cases for sure, because it tested whether or not strictly following the law may end up in a miscarriage of justice. And do judges have we take oaths, and I've always followed my oaths as best as I can. I never bent the law knowingly to achieve the result that I particularly wanted. And, you know, if you're in landlord-tenant court, you can have some very hard situations there where tenants get evicted and you feel very sorry for them, but the law demands that. So, you know, this is not just an unusual situation. It is one of the hardest parts of being a judge. And just for interest of time, this is a case where jury sort of let us know that they're about to find the defendant guilty of an offense that would carry a 5-year mandatory sentence. Had I, through a jury note they sent us, had I tried the case alone as the judge, I would easily found him not guilty. The defendant was 4 years old. He had no criminal record. He was a manager at
the defendant was 4 years old?
40.
40, oh, okay.
40 years old. He worked at the Safeway for 15 years. And even more importantly, he was a single dad for 2 young teenage daughters. And I thought sending him to jail for 5 years would really be harsh and unfair. And we don't have time to get into all the details now, but at one point I encouraged that just while the jury was literally at the door to come in to reach the verdict, which we all knew was going to be guilty, as to whether or not he should plead guilty to an offense that would not carry the mandatory 5 years. And that was difficult, you know, because I had to wink at a number of different things. And the question, should I do it? Should I take this plea? Even though he knew, the defendant knew, I didn't think he should go to 5 years. Indeed, if I gave him 5 years, he would have felt that I had misled him. And so that's where the drama became, is should I take the plea? Should I maybe bend the law to achieve a just result? So I guess I'd like to say, if you want to know what I did, you can read it in the book.
Well, read the book, because there's an unbelievable twist. And the book makes you think. And since I know that 1 in 9 people in DC is a lawyer, and the rest of them haven't gotten there yet, but I hope that they will. You know, it's a fascinating look at the very difficult and sometimes gut-wrenching things that judges have to do, and lawyers, not to mention our clients. So in the Right to Die case, can you read a little something from that one?
This was also a very wrenching case because, for obvious reasons, a 51-year-old woman in otherwise good health had a catastrophic heart attack, and she very quickly went into a persistent vegetative state where she had no cognitive ability at all, pretty much like the Terry Schiavo case. And sadly, on top of this catastrophic matter, she had never noted in a legal matter or even in her life what she would have wanted to have done if something like that happened to her. And the law in DC was a little bit unclear. It was a lot unclear as to what to do. And her adult daughter became her guardian. Her guardian ad litem for the ward was now Judge Katie Weidman. And so the decision had to be made, and I call her YP. Her sisters, her four sisters, were adamantly opposed to terminating life support, and for religious and other reasons. And so I consulted with a number of my colleagues, including the late Leonard Brayman, and the part that I'd like to read goes like this. I also reflected on the exercise of judicial power and its far-reaching consequences. I have permanently taken a child away from her abusive parents and also sentenced a rapist to life in prison who gratuitously killed his victim. I have also evicted a mother and her children from their home when the mother's only sin was that she was too poor to pay the rent. In protecting a child and giving her a chance to thrive in another loving family, or protecting the community from reprehensible violence, judicial power can be a righteous force for good. In evicting a poor family from their home, judicial power feels like a reluctant, validating force for legal and economic order. On either end of the scale, the scope of the consequences is profound, and I have a healthy respect for the magnitude of the decision that I have to make. The judges I most admire and aspire to emulate not only have the intellect to understand the complexity of the law, but more importantly, have reached a balance in their lives to appreciate the limitations of a person's ability to make life-altering decisions while embracing the responsibility to do so. Calling it the getting of wisdom, if you will.
Again, it makes you think. You tell a story, these factually fascinating cases, and then you stop and ponder and think it through, and the reader gets to work through your process to get to what I agree in each case was the right decision, but very, very difficult. And nowhere does it say, oh, this is the way you should do it. You have to get there. Very, very well worth reading.
I just glanced at the time.
Me too, and we want to get to Q&A.
Right.
And so I want to invite people to go to the question and answer tab at the bottom and write your questions in the Q&A, and we will try to get to some of them. While we wait for a couple of questions to go in, Russ, what were the qualities when you thought about being a judge? What did you think the most important qualities were? And has that changed at all?
Well, I've admired so many judges as a trial lawyer. And
I'll bet you didn't admire several too.
Yeah, there were a few on that list as well. Even
That was
Superior
me.
Court.
You don't have to say it. I was there.
But I will say, I'm not just saying this,
Blushing.
I really do think the Superior Court has some of the very best judges in the country. Part of that's because of the selection system, which I think really is the commission that nominates judges is merit-based. And even though that then goes to the White House and becomes, to some degree, a political thing, it becomes a merit-based selection process because of our commission. And so obviously people who have integrity and decency and common sense and the temperament to listen patiently to folks, even though you may know the answer already, and to make tough decisions. It's a very human nature to try to compromise decisions so everybody comes off a little bit happy. And in many cases, that is the right answer, but sometimes it's just not. Sometimes you just have to make the tough decision, and knowing full well that you're going to disappoint litigants and lawyers. And I think reaching that balance of knowing when to try to settle a case, a civil or even a criminal case, and knowing when that's not appropriate and you just have to make the hard call. So the judge is like, a mentor to me, and he sadly died just before I went on the bench, was Judge Robert Schuker, who really helped me a lot become a judge. And he taught me a lot as I was growing up in the courts, so to speak.
He was a lovely guy and a very good judge. Okay, here's one. What's the funniest thing you've seen on the bench? My kind of question.
That is a good question. Some of it's X-rated, so I'm not going to go there, quite frankly.
Yeah.
So, no, that'll be offline. I'll say.
I'll buy the martini.
Yeah. Nothing immediately comes to mind, so I think I'm going to pass on that.
I remember Judge Wolf once saying, I was in the courtroom with Greta, and Judge Wolf turned to a man and said, "Sir, remove your hat." And he says, "It's a toupee, Your Honor." That's one of the funniest things I've seen. Okay, let's see. As a DC judge, you've watched the Metropolitan Police Department in action over many years. What's your take on the defund police movement in DC and nationally?
All right, so my personal view is that the vast majority of DC police do an honest, hardworking job, and they protect us. And quite frankly, as a judge, I've gained more respect for the police at times, knowing how on a typical traffic stop, and more police die in traffic stops than anything else because they don't know who they're stopping. And so they may be stopping someone who's running from a bench warrant for murder. So, I mean, not many of us are willing to put our lives on the line every single day. Now, of course, there are bad ones who've done horrible things. I don't like the term defund the police because I don't think it works. If it means reform the police, yes, of course, the police needs to be reformed. I think part of the things we need to do is just decriminalize a lot of the things. We arrest people for a lot of things that in other countries just aren't crimes. You get a civil ticket to pay a fine of $10 or $25 or something like that. To make it a crime means there's the potential of going to prison. And I think we could take away a lot of that by decriminalizing a lot of the minor crimes, because a lot of the things that happen are over minor crimes. Eric Garner and George Floyd and things like that. These are minor crimes that really the police don't need to be involved in. So I think defund the police is a term that doesn't really speak to me, but I think the aspects of all parts of the court we can reform. I think the Supreme Court does a great job, but I'm not blind nor naive. I think there's also always parts of the court, police, the defense bar, prosecutors that we could reform, and we're constantly trying to do that in DC.
So this isn't a well-known fact, but I have 3 first cousins who were cops, and I love cops as much as I fought with them when I was a defense attorney. And as much as we all know, they're not all great. There are flawed cops, just as there are flawed everybody. But we do have 25% more cops than similarly situated jurisdictions, and in addition to the 32 different police units that we have in DC. So for me, it isn't defund them, it's where should the funding go where the right group of people intervene. It doesn't always have to be a cop. It should be mental health professionals and others, and what community investments can we make. So I really agree with you. I've got another question from Barry Coburn. I was thinking about what you just said about the exercise of judicial power. Based on your long experience as both a trial lawyer and a judge, how much of a role do you think that emotion plays? anger, sympathy, other emotion in judicial decision-making?
Well, we try very hard not to let emotion and anger or sympathy, play, but judges are human beings. So if you see a victim who's been terrorized, there's going to be a sort of a natural human emotion to sympathize with her. Or if you see a defendant, a typical pre-sentence report lists a defendant's crimes, and you first read about the crime and his past history, and you say, "Oh my goodness, this is a dangerous guy." And then you read about his background, and more often than not, the background is incredibly sympathetic, usually without as much parental guidance as I had growing up, with the education and mental illness, and all the 68% of the people in the DC jail have mental illness. So there's so many more things that go into a criminal case. But judges have to be very careful, because it's, your sympathy for one case could be another judge's sympathy, can completely sing a case differently. So we try as best we can to be, at least I do, somewhere in the middle, quite frankly. So you don't get pulled too much by emotion. That being said, if you go to a murder sentencing, it's like a wedding. On one side of the courtroom is going to be the victim's family, and the other side is going to be the defendant's family, and the raw emotion that comes from that is hard to pack away somewhere in your own brain, in your own heart.
On a similar vein, for our last question, Dale Kaufman asks, in your death penalty work, did you ever have to face a victim's family who objected to your view that the life should be saved? What did you say to them?
I did quite a bit, and it was always, if for no other reason than tactical, we would always try to reach the family to see what they felt about it. And those are very difficult conversations. Most of the families were respectful and understood our role. Some did not, quite frankly, and thought we were equivalent to our clients. So, but it's a phone call you make. It's a visit to someone's home that you make, and occasionally you'll get a victim's family who doesn't want to go for the death penalty, and the prosecution doesn't have to go along with it, but sometimes they do. So it's a balance.
And it's no easy task. It's not for the faint of heart. There's a comment, not a question. You were one of the best and elite judges that I and my colleagues had the honor and privilege to appear before. Colleen Kennedy. I guess you are still sitting as a senior judge.
Yeah.
So you'll be back after the pandemic.
Yes.
Doing just
I look forward to going back. I said 8 to 10 weeks a year. Thank you, Colleen. She was and Barry Coburn, also an excellent lawyer, and Colleen was a terrific prosecutor who focused a lot on mental health issues, and we worked together on a number of committees doing any number of things.
very cool, very cool. So any last thoughts other than people should buy this book and your first book because they're great books? And they will really enjoy them. I couldn't put it down. I mean, I sat down Saturday morning and I finished it Sunday morning. Well, I'm not saying I was up all night. It wasn't that good.
I think I'm going to make you my agent now, Shelly, to sell some more books there. So you do it much better than I do. Okay. So it's been, to me, a very fulfilling experience. Not only the legal cases, but reminiscing about Sister Joseph Beatrice. I look forward to the day of driving down to Kentucky and going to the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth and talking with her colleagues there, because I know they'll really appreciate it. And it's put me together with so many wonderful people in this journey. So it's for me personally, it has struck a deep chord.
I love that she came to your swearing in. She was in the front row.
She was.
That's in the book.
Row. My mom had passed away. My dad was homebound by that time, and Sister Joseph had to be in her 80s at this point, maybe 84, 5, or 6. And so it was a trip for her to come up to Washington, D.C., and she sat in the front row and winked at me. So it was really one of the very special nights.
Very, very cool. They're not interrupting us and telling us we have to stop. So let me just ask you, what's next? What's the next book?
I'm not quite sure yet. I've always wanted to try my hand at writing a novel and make things up, and as long as it was not a courtroom drama novel, but try something new and different. So I'll see what happens. It might be fun to play around with that a little bit.
How did you get started writing?
Well, it really became when Fred Weisberg and Jeb Boasberg and I were having dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant, Pasta Mia.
Which is what?
It's no longer there. He retired. It was a friend of mine had the restaurant, and we got to talking about our toughest cases. And some I knew, some I didn't know. And then Greg Mize got in the conversation, and he told me this amazing story and Greg and I are good friends, but I didn't know this story about a child abuse and neglect case. That's really an amazing story. And we just thought it would be helpful. There's so much written by academia about the law, and a lot of appellate judges have written books, but very, very few from trial judges. And quite frankly, the trial judges are the ones who are doing the justice on a day-to-day level. And I think we thought
where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, that's where things really happen.
Yeah. I don't know if we're supposed to end at exactly 7 or if, Bashan, I don't want to get the hook, but I want to keep talking. So, thank you.
I was enjoying it as well. So, I mean, no worries. But actually, surprise, I have the last question. And this is for both Judge Canan and Professor Broderick. Could you both please tell everyone watching if you're currently reading anything, because that's something we all would like to know.
Well, I just finished a book that I've been meaning to read for a very long time called American Prometheus, which is the biography of Robert Oppenheimer, who is the father of the atomic bomb, and who then later, for the younger viewers may not know this, became one of the most high-profile victims of the McCarthy era. And it was a magnificent book. I learned so much about Oppenheimer, but also about the making of the atomic bomb, the decision to actually use it, and Oppenheimer's internal regret of his part and role in it. And notwithstanding all that, he was still taken and run through the mud and the muck of the McCarthy era. The only positive part about that was he basically got redemption. It's a theme in my book by President Kennedy and President Johnson. And he was in his lifetime, people recognized not only his contributions to the country, but the sorry show that called into question his loyalty.
There was a great play called In the Prime of J. Robert Oppenheimer, which I saw when I was in high school at the Vivian Beaumont Theater in New York. So that sounds like a great book. So my dear friend Abby Smith has written a book called Guilty People, and I think she's actually, maybe she with her books, she usually comes to Politics and Prose too. So I think you have Abby Smith coming in soon. But Guilty People is a story about guilty lawyers, guilty judges, guilty defendants. And, it's the players in this arena and how they come together. And it too is wonderful and well worth reading. But best book last year, definitely Overstory. And Frederick Douglass biography. Fantastic, both of them.
On behalf of Politics and Prose, I want to thank both of you for this wonderful event and for sharing your personal stories, Judge Canan. And of course, I'd like to thank everyone who's attended. Once again, please purchase a copy of Pursuing Justice and also Tough Cases, both written by Judge Canan. And we want to wish you all a good evening. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you, Bashan. Thank you so much for everything.
Great to meet you, Bashan. Take care.
Likewise.